I spent the last year co-authoring a book about clean energy, about how we develop a clean energy future. We call it Apollo's Fire because we want to harken back to the idea that the original Apollo project. And looking at this thing, I became more and more convinced that you have to develop new technologies to help solve this problem. It's just absolutely fundamentally key to solving this problem. There's just no way we can do enough trees or algae, or you just got to have new technology. If that's true, and I ask this Mr. Blanchard, Mr. George, Mr. Boucher, doesn't it make sense, if we're going to have offsets, to focus on those that Mr. Rahm suggested in this gold standard that direct this offset investment towards investments that will spur new technological growth, both in efficiency and in renewable energy sources, as opposed to sequestration or land use or some areas? Isn't that a higher value? And if so, what does the consumer know about that between the various offset markets that are out there?
Well, could I answer that briefly? When you don't put a ton of carbon dioxide into the Earth's atmosphere, you don't cause any further harm to the planet. When you hire a tree or a green plant in the ocean to take that ton of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and turn it into those living plants, that living ecosystem, it's no longer harming the planet, but it's also healing the harm done to date and providing an ongoing healing form. And what we're concerned about with global warming, with carbon dioxide in the air, is the harm it does to the living planet, right? It's the harm that it's doing to the ecosystems of the planet. So why not employ those ecosystems, which are in a dramatically reduced state? Why not bring them back? In Hungary, it used to be 17% forest. It used to be 70% forest. It's now 17%. We're going to plant 250,000 acres of new forest in Hungary that goes into the national park system there that will be very heavily protected. It'll be a long-term, enormous benefit to that ecosystem there. And the same thing goes in restoring the ocean. If we don't restore the harm already done by climate change, by carbon dioxide, what good does it do to do no further harm, right? We have to also heal the harm done.
I just want to know, one concern I have is what really results in geological storage. You got to have geological storage to make this. Trees fall over and die and they decompose, and then their CO2 is emitted. And I suppose what you're telling me is that these credits you're buying is to keep these forests in perpetuity, so you just replace the tree that's fallen down and decomposed? Is that the idea?
Forests are self-sustaining green machines that keep themselves going in perpetuity. The fossil fuel age is only about 200 years old at best, really 100 years old in high gear. By all accounts, it's only going to last a few hundred years longer. In the ocean, it's very easy to see carbon repositioned in the deep ocean for periods of millennia. Right? It may be back 2,000 years from now, but the fossil fuel age will be long gone.
I want to ask about the certified emissions reductions. As I understand, these are certificates in Europe. Do your markets, and I ask all of you, do you use those? Do you invest in them? And are they a prototype that we should consider in the United States?
You have
a certificate. I'm going to ask all the panel, not just from Mr. George. Anyone that wants to answer the question, go ahead. But anyone?
Mr. Inslee, the certified emission reductions are actually units that are created under the Kyoto Protocol. The European Union has a trading system set up that recognizes those credits. I think certainly within the framework that the Kyoto Protocol has established, these are credible carbon offset instruments. The questions have been raised about projects here and there, but overall it's a pretty credible mechanism.
So, Mr. Blanchard, in your company, do you sell those? Do you meet those certification standards?
Well, no, because they're really for sale within the Kyoto Protocol. They're not really for sale in the voluntary market. There are VERs, voluntary emission reductions, that are, again, it's just a denomination of the credit that are held to a very similar standard, typically from developing countries. We sell projects that are in the United States. And so we don't right now sell anything that would qualify there. I think there are standards in development, though, including the gold standard that Mr. Rahm was talking about before, that incorporate most, if not all, of the same the same attributes that those CERs and VERs.
So would you
do
meet
have.
their standards in a domestic context?
Well, today it's not so much a question of whether we meet the standards, sir. It's more a question of whether the projects do. I actually went to the gold standard project database this morning, anticipating some of this conversation, and there is only one project listed in that database that's operational today.
Thank you.
You know, you have to understand that carbon credits are you should think about them in terms of bottles of wine. They have a vintage year and a label. And there's quite a large variety of different carbon credit markets out there. It's important each year. The vintage is important because we retire the credits on an annual basis. But the label's also critically important. So there's a plethora of different labels of carbon credits emerging in the markets around the world, especially those markets where there's mandatory requirements.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the...
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple of quick questions. Mr. Broekhoff, to you. You said you all were developing some accounting standards on carbon offsets. So let me ask you this. Do you think that it is possible or that we should even try to develop federal guidelines for voluntary carbon offsets, develop some guidelines that would clarify the voluntary carbon offset industry and still preserve it as a voluntary industry? What is your take on that, or should we just leave it alone and avoid full-scale government regulation?
I think it's possible for the federal government to provide some oversight and guidance, for example, in recommending best practice accounting protocols for the quantification of carbon offsets. Also, perhaps in terms of certifying verifiers or certifying registries that could serve this market without directly providing, controlling the market.